Hello, and welcome to another episode of Real Talk on Renal Cancer, sponsored by the Judy Nicholson Kidney Cancer Foundation, also with gracious support from Exelixis, Ipsen, and Merck. I am your host, Laura Esfeller, and I am so pleased today to have on the podcast my dear friend and colleague from SWOG, Dr. Ben Maughan. Hi, how are you, Dr. Maughan?
It's so wonderful to talk to you again, Laura, and it's nice to be on this program. It's fantastic hearing about it and all the great work that the foundation does for patients. So
Yeah.
thanks. I really appreciate being on.
Thank you so much. We are really trying hard at the Judy Nicholson Foundation to make sure that we have great resources for our, patients and caregivers and the kidney cancer community. And so this is part of that. So happy to have you here today. Dr. Maughan, maybe you can start off with sharing a little bit about where you're practicing, kind of how you got started into GU and kidney cancer oncology.
Yeah, so originally I was a pharmacist, and then I met a colleague and now a good friend of mine, Dr. Niraj Agarwal. He was a mentor and attending when I was in medical school, and at that time I was really debating between do I want to go into oncology as a hematologist and treat leukemia and myelodysplastic syndromes, or do I want to do what his focus was, or still is, genitourinary oncology, and he deftly guided me towards this specialty. So yeah, it's been fantastic. So I met him when I was a resident here at the University of Utah, and Dr. Agarwal has been here that entire time, and again, he has guided me in so many different ways, including reeling me back here. It was an easy thing to do, but reeling me back here after fellowship finished. So yeah, I've been on faculty here since 2016, with again a specialty in genitourinary medical oncology. The parts of it that really drew me to this and helped me like decide on this as my focus and specialty is both intellectual and emotional. So the intellectually, the type of diseases that we're treating, like kidney cancer, the biology of this disease is very interesting. It's a very difficult and challenging problem to try and address. But emotionally, it's very rewarding for me because, I am able to form these relationships with patients and treat them for frequently for quite an extended period of time. And especially with the innovation with immune therapy, that's really helping us improve the prognosis, which just is very emotionally rewarding to be able to, help patients with this difficult disease. So I've been here ever since, and it's a fantastic place to practice and work. And fortunately, we're connected with SWOG, and that's how you and I met. And that was, it's a great organization as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I know I'm so personally connected to SWOG even before I joined. And, I realize a lot of times we in the oncology community talk in acronyms and all. And so I want to make sure that our listeners understand that SWOG is, one of the part of the clinical trial network within the NCI. And, that's kind of how we roll out research for not just kidney cancer, but obviously other, cancers that need a lot of help and support. And so SWOG is an arm of that. And I've been really fortunate that I've been able to join SWOG as a patient advocate because, again, I think a lot of times as a patient who once joined a SWOG trial, I didn't understand that patients were at the table. And then I was really happy to hear that patients are part of that process whenever we're developing a clinical trial concept. So, maybe I know that you, in addition to your very busy clinical schedule, that you also do research as well. And would you maybe mind sharing with our listeners kind of what that looks like, and how do you have time for all this? Which is always my question to all of you. I'm so amazed that you all just have apparently you don't sleep, I think is the answer.
Well, somehow that does find its way in, and I definitely do sleep. But it's really interesting with SWOG, it's not an acronym. It used to be, but
Right,
it's not an acronym anymore. Like that's the actual name. I think before you and I got involved with them, they officially changed their name from Southwest Oncology Group to SWOG,
right.
right?
Yeah,
To keep the branding, I suppose. But yeah, it's been a great organization to be involved with because the type of research that I do is clinical and translational, right? So obviously there's a lot of amazing researchers, whether MDs, DOs, or PhDs, among many others that are in the lab trying to discover new biology, new science, new compounds to test. But they're very lab based. They're working with like cell line models or animal models or something. But I'm on sort of that other end of the spectrum where I start from the patient and kind of like work backwards. So like I will test new compounds in patients via clinical trials or for patients that are gracious enough to donate some blood samples or tissue samples, we'll take that to the lab and study it. So I don't run or have my own personal lab, but we're able to partner with like businesses that will run, as various DNA or molecular tests for us, or, the university that I work at has some core labs where they just run these tests for you. I mean, you kind of like rent it, you pay them, but it's not for free. But they'll actually do the testing process for me. So I'm still able to do, there's ways that I can get this translational or sort of lab-based work done. And the most common way that I accomplish that is by partnering with people that do have labs. So I'll provide access to the tissue samples or something. They'll actually run the lab work, and then we sort of collaborate and discuss the results. But most of my research time is spent in designing and conducting clinical trials.
that's great. And I think that I really appreciate your answer because I feel like it really highlights just how intricate of a network, for lack of better words, that clinical trials are, right? Again, from a patient perspective, usually you don't really understand kind of the back end of, what it takes to create a clinical trial, to get it approved, to go, to where you are testing this theory on patients. And I think it's interesting to see that, we know you're not in a lab somewhere kind of holed away looking at tissue samples necessarily, but just kind of how all these different trials come together is really interesting, and I appreciate the kind of back end knowledge because it's not something that I think most patients and caregivers are aware of, that this is what it takes. One
Yeah,
thing
if
that
you
I
if you think about
yeah,
it, there's sorry about interrupting.
no,
There's
go
this
ahead.
whole regulatory process that goes into saying yes, this treatment is safe and effective to prescribe patients. So if you're thinking about a clinical trial, I'm prescribing a treatment and I'm treating a patient with a non-FDA approved therapy. So in order to do that, there's this whole regulatory framework of how to go about participating in that activity. So we have to create this clinical trial. There's a specific protocol that's a legally binding document that says this is how we're going to treat the patient, and when problems come up, this is how we're going to approach it, so that it creates this legal framework to make it, I guess it provides the guardrails to ensure as much safety as possible to do this non-approved therapy for patients. And then as part of that protocol, we're also talking about these are the things that we're going to be measuring to make sure that we can determine at the end of the day, is this an effective approach for patients? And here's the sort of monitoring we're going to be doing to make sure it's safe for the patients. So yeah, there's this whole behind the scenes part that goes on before the trial even opens to say this is how we're going to do it. Takes a lot of time, but it's worth doing.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. I want to pull on that thread a little bit because I think you touched on something that is a concern that I think many patients have whenever they are considering a clinical trial, right? Is this something that's going to be safe for me to participate in? And, of course, I know we can't guarantee patient safety, right? Every patient is different, how they respond to these treatments or, different modalities can be different. But, I think that you brought up a really good point that you have all of these people that come together and, you have to have a legally binding document that says, okay, here's all the things that we're going to do to increase patient safety as much as possible and keep that at the forefront as to what we're doing. I also think that you did a really great job of illustrating why it takes so long sometimes to get a clinical trial into play and why it takes, at least from patient perspective, again, I think sometimes something I hear often is, well, why aren't there new drugs? Why aren't there new things that we can do? And I know from my work with you and SWOG and, everything that it takes a long time to get a clinical trial, especially whenever you're testing in humans, from start to finish. Do you, especially with your background in, pharmacy and all, do you have maybe words of advice or wisdom for patients that are kind of just maybe struggling or frustrated with, do I need to be concerned about my safety on a trial and or why is this taking so long?
Yeah, I think those are really great points. I mean, in terms of safety, the answer really for a specific patient is going to be different depending on what type of trial they're involved in, because there are different types of trials, right? And I think of it in terms of like the life cycle of a compound, right? So is it and the end of that life cycle is FDA approval. I mean, in terms of like the research life cycle of a compound, right? So the end is now it's been shown to be effective. Now it's been shown to be safe enough that we can use in regular practice. So it gets the stamp of approval by I say FDA because that's I'm here in the United States, but if you're in Europe, it's the European Authority, et cetera. But it's that regulatory approval depending on where you are. But leading up to that, there's these multiple steps, and depending on where you are, the focus of the research is a little bit different, right? So initially in like the laboratory-based studies, when you're very first trying to understand a compound, can it even kill cancer cells, for instance? It's all about the molecular biology. I want to try and kill the cancer cell in this way, and does this compound bind to whatever my target is and ultimately kill the cancer cell. So you're doing all these lab studies. But then it moves into sort of the later phase of the preclinical, we call it, space, where then you really start focusing on safety. You're trying to get an idea about, well, what kind of problems does this cause? So then that's when you test it out in different animals, and different animal models are designed to try and as close as possible reproduce some body parts. So like pigs are oftentimes used to try and understand human skin toxicity, and other animals will be chosen to look at, cardiac toxicity. And by cobbling all those different animal models together, you can try to get an idea about what the likely toxicities are. But once you reach that point, and if it seems like it's going to be safe enough, that's when you start testing it in people. And at the very beginning, the focus 100% is on safety. And it's only later in that sort of life cycle that you transition to the focus primarily being efficacy. Now, we care about both of these things, throughout this research process, but the trials initially are designed 100% around safety. And then later on, they're more about efficacy. And the reason for that is we're trying to accomplish two things at the same time. We're trying to not hurt patients, but we're also trying to help patients, right? So the thing that takes priority first is not hurting patients. So these very first initial trials, when we're testing that compound in patients for the very first time, we call those phase 1 studies. Those are very sort of intense in terms of the requirement from patients. There's a lot of follow-up, there's a lot of blood draws, and that's because it's the first time we're testing that compound, that drug, or perhaps a drug combination. But it's the first time that's being tested in humans. So we have an expectation of what we think the toxicities will be, but we're not absolutely certain. And so there's just a lot of extra pieces built in. And so it's a lot to ask for patients to participate in those types of trials. But then later on, as you have tested it in more and more patients, you get much more confident about these are the toxicities that we're seeing and these are the problems that we can expect. And so then you can design bigger studies, to include more patients, and really start focusing on the efficacy. So getting back to your question about how confident can the patient feel about, like, is this going to hurt me or not? That really depends on, is this a phase 1 study and this is the first time we're exploring in humans, or is this a phase 3 clinical trial and it's already been tested in multiple other human clinical trials, and we have much more confidence about the safety profile of the drug. So it kind of depends on where that drug or combination is in the research life cycle of the drug.
Yeah, I think that was amazing. Thank you. I really appreciate that because again, whenever you're diagnosed with cancer, especially if you're diagnosed stage 4, I vaguely remembered what my kidneys did from high school and college biology when I was first diagnosed, right? I mean,
They
that
do
was
something for the
right. I was
body,
like,
right?
it's there. I know it's there. I haven't thought about this in a long time, right? So, you're immediately being hit with like, first I need to understand what in the world is going on in my body, right? And then having to digest what a clinical trial is, if that's something that you're discussing with your provider. And, I mean, like I said, I've admitted before, maybe not on this podcast, but I've admitted this before that I who I consider myself to be a fairly educated person, didn't even understand when I first signed up for the clinical trial that I was in that it was, a phase 2 and what that meant, right? And I knew that the drugs were, being tested. I didn't understand even that it was the difference between immunotherapy and targeted therapy, right? I learned all of that in time, but whenever I signed those consent forms, I didn't fully understand. I think it's really important for patients to know that, not every trial, to your point, is a phase 1 where it's first in human and we don't really know. I mean, we have an idea from the animal models, but we don't really know what that looks like from a safety perspective versus a phase 2 or phase 3 trial that is really more trying to figure out like treatment versus treatment or dosage and things of that nature. So I really appreciate the overview because I do think it helps patients be able to make better informed decisions if they are considering a clinical trial.
Yeah, I personally haven't been a patient or certainly a cancer patient faced with this before. So I always sometimes try and imagine what it might be like. And the best I've come up with is like an auto mechanic. Like I'm not a car person. I just turn it on and, and
Yeah.
I'm expecting it to work, right? And so occasionally when I've had to, go to the mechanic before and they're like, well, this is kind of broken. And I'm like, I have no idea what that is, but I guess we need to fix it. Right. It's that like,
Yeah.
I, I know what this experience is like when it's working for me, but when it's broken, I don't know how important that thing is. So it helps me appreciate how much trust there really is in that relationship.
It's true.
It's like the
And
mechanic says, we got to fix this. I'm like, okay, we
right.
got to fix this.
Same. I am also not a car person. And so I also just trust the mechanic is going to fix whatever needs to be fixed. And yeah, to your point, it really does require a lot of trust on the patient's part and their caregivers because like I'm not a mechanic, I am not an oncologist. So it's really helpful. Talking about the
Yeah,
clinical
so
trial.
when I think about it like that, it just is really sort of like humbling to me in a way, like when I see these patients like, day in and day out and, just thinking about like how much trust they're putting in me. I mean, certainly, I try to educate them and help them understand what's going on, but, just realizing how much trust there is in my judgment on these things is really sort of, I don't know, quite humbling. So.
Yeah. And that's true. I mean, I implicitly trusted my oncologist, right? I mean, my late oncologist, Dr. Vogelzang, and I trusted him from the moment I walked into his office, right? So, and he did a great job of explaining, what my cancer was and why he thought that the trial would be a good option for me. But even with all of his explaining, I still didn't fully understand until much later on, the purpose of the trial and what it was doing. So
Well, having personally known Dr. Vogelzang, I think that trust was well placed. He was an incredible mentor for so many of us. But what was it like for you when you were thinking about, getting back to your question of safety, when you were thinking about like the risk for you and like how did you process that and what was it like?
And it's
Now I'm turning the tables on your
no, it's
podcast, but
okay. I
I
love
really want to
it.
hear this.
Please, I love it. I love it. No, for me, I mean, obviously safety was a big concern. I had done some research on clinical trials and not like specific clinical trials, but just in general, what that looks like as part of a treatment plan. And I talked with actually two kidney cancer survivors who were also in their 30s. That thankfully they were earlier stage than I was, but they had encouraged me, hey, if you ever get an opportunity to join a clinical trial, you should consider it. So I wasn't opposed to it, but I was concerned about the safety aspect of it just because, I had seen family members and friends go through cancer treatment. I didn't know anybody up to that point that had been on targeted therapy or even immunotherapy, but I'd seen people go through chemo and radiation. And so that was kind of my mental image of what this might look like. And, I was concerned about the side effects being mainly my focus was trying to get back to work, and to get to some sense of normalcy. And so I was worried about like, am I going to be too sick to return to work and, do things with my family and things like that. I wasn't really worried about like it being something that would be fatal, like a fatal side effect, although I knew that was a possibility, but I felt confident that, that it would maybe just be not a great experience, but that wouldn't necessarily be something that would, wind me up in the hospital. But honestly, at that point, in my treat or in my cancer journey, for lack of better words, I was cognizant of how sick I was. I mean, I had extensive mets in my liver and lungs and, pretty much all the lymph nodes in my chest. And so I knew things weren't good. And quite frankly, I like my hope was that it was going to do well, but I had pretty much accepted that I probably was going to die within the next year. And so my hope was like, hopefully this will help a future patient, or help researchers understand what's happening. But, I think those were more of my concerns than like, is this something that is going to like the side effects going to be fatal to me or not? I was worried about the cancer being fatal and just the side effects, would they be manageable or not?
Yeah, every time I think about this specific topic, I'm just so grateful for all the patients that have, been courageous and have gone through research in the past. When I'm thinking about a clinical trial and talking to a patient, in front of me, I really have two major objectives at that moment in time. One is, and probably the most important thing I'm trying to accomplish is, I'm trying to find something that I think can be really helpful for them specifically, right? Like, and so a second objective that I'm trying to do, certainly to me anyway, it's a secondary objective, and that's to learn some more knowledge to kind of pay it forward to help everybody else that's struggling with this, either now or in the future will be struggling with this, as you alluded to. And I'm just so grateful for all those people that are currently doing it, but especially all those people that have already done it in the many preceding years. When I was an oncology pharmacist, which again I was before I did this, crazy journey to go on and become a doctor. Despite my mother's protestation, she wanted me to stay a pharmacist, which is a story for another time. Anyway, at that time. So this would have been like around 2004 or something like that. So not that long ago. The average survival for patients with metastatic kidney cancer was really short. I mean, every patient, has a different experience, but at that time, sort of an expected or average survival was only 9 months. It was incredibly short. And that's because we had very few treatment options, and even those rarely worked. But through all the courageous efforts that's, countless and thousands of patients have gone through and accepting to, participate in clinical, research trials, we now have quite a number, quite an array of treatments, that are helping so many patients like yourself and others. And patients are living much longer than they did before, even to this time now where we are really starting to have evidence that, with the power and potency of immune therapy, we're curing some patients that have metastatic disease. Unfortunately, it's what many of us would consider a really small number. So there's a lot of ongoing research still to try and make this a possibility for a lot more patients. But that's a revolutionary shift. That's a tremendous change compared to where we were. And it's all because of, the courage that patients have to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's something that gets lost sometimes whenever, I just celebrated my 8th cancer anniversary. So last week was, thank you. So last week was 8 years since I was diagnosed.
Actually, I don't know if I should be clapping.
No, you should be. You
I
should
mean,
be. It's okay. I called it a cancer anniversary.
I
You
started thinking, well,
absolutely
now am I clapping
no,
because
no
you
clap.
have it, or
No, I'm reclaiming my power. It's a cancer anniversary, so you should absolutely clap. It's worthy of celebration.
okay, well, I'll do it again. I'll do it.
Thank you. But I see patients. Obviously, a lot of patients I interact with now are recently diagnosed or have been diagnosed within the last like 2 to 4 years, let's call it, right? And it's humbling to see because I think about how, wow, whenever I was diagnosed, which again is only 8 years ago, but actually so much has changed in just 8 years, right? Within kidney cancer. And I know that people go, oh gosh, like, why isn't more happening? I'm like, guys, so much has happened. So much has happened just in the short time, that I was diagnosed. And even I think about how I had a conversation with an oncologist. I think it was about a year in. I'd at least had one good scan at that point, so I was feeling pretty good. And she said, look, I'm just being honest with you. Looking at your case, had you been diagnosed 5, 10 years ago, like we would have just sent you home in hospice probably, right? Because I had a large primary tumor, the vena cava blockage and everything. And so it's really incredible to think of how far things have come. And of course, obviously we still have, a ways to go, but that it's really impressive to think about how much has happened. And to your point, a lot of it has happened because of patients that signed up for clinical trials and have participated in research and that are kind of moving the needle forward. Maybe not as fast as we sometimes want it to be, but it's moving. We're moving in the right direction.
One other point to that I always like to try and emphasize for patients, with metastatic kidney cancer is that because of the progress we've made already, the, anticipated, survival time is long enough now for patients that you should be expecting that in your individual lifetime, we will be making additional improvements or changes, right? That may not be true if someone has a diagnosis where, they're expected to die over the course of a few months to maybe a year. That's just not enough time to get a lot accomplished. But, now that patients are living for multiple years, it is, I think, a realistic expectation that not only will there be a number of novel clinical trials that they may have the opportunity to participate in, but there should be some unique FDA approvals in their lifetimes.
I love that. So speaking of clinical trials, I know that one of the things that I find really special about the research that one of the things that you're doing, and along with many other things that you do for the kidney cancer community, is the clinical trial that you're working on with SWOG, which I have a soft spot in my heart for because it's actually the the I don't want to say phase 2. That's a little misleading, but it's the second movie. It's the sequel, I guess, to the trial that I was on, which was PatMet. And I say this all the time to Dr. Monty Paul and other people that like I'm literally here because of your research. And Dr. Paul's such a like modest guy. He's like, no, no, no. I'm like, no, really, really, I am literally here because of your research. And so maybe if you don't mind sharing a little bit, Dr. Mon, about kind of, you know, maybe the work that you're doing on PatMet too. What does that look like? What kind of, how did we get here from the trial I was on to now?
Yeah, I think really this story begins a few years ago, even before PatMet 1, the trial that you participated in and have benefited so much from. One of the incredible innovations that's occurred over the past, I don't know, 15 years or so, and is continuing to this day, is we're better understanding kidney cancers, like the underlying molecular biology. And that's really important. In the past, the way that we understood all cancers, including kidney cancer, was just how they looked under the microscope. You could use certain dyes to sort of stain or enhance for certain proteins or whatever, and that was helpful, and it was a good place to start. But there's a lot of missing information there. There's a lot of the biologic characteristics that you're just missing that way. But be that as it may, based on that limited amount of information, what we understood is that kidney cancers generally came in one of two flavors. It was either clear cell or anything else. And so the anything else we called non-clear cell. Clear cell represents about 75% of all kidney cancers, and that's important for this discussion because what that means is the majority of patients have that specific diagnosis. And because that's where almost all the patients are, that's where almost all the research was. It was like just about that type of cancer. And then for the longest time, we've just been saying, okay, treatment X worked in patients with clear cell kidney cancer, so that's what we'll do for these other cancers too. And as we've now better understood the molecular biology of all these cancers, what we've learned is that this 25% of everything else that we've traditionally called non-clear cell kidney cancer is actually a mixture of dozens of different types of diseases, all with unique underlying biology. And so now we're beginning to understand why some of these non-clear cell kidney cancers actually do respond pretty well to treatments that we use for clear cell, but others don't respond at all. So we're at this point now where we're better understanding this. We're still not at a great place yet with designing a lot of trials specifically around that biology, but we're at the point where we are better understanding that biology. So regarding this clinical trial that I'm helping to lead, called PatMet 2 or SWOG 2200, this is exploring a treatment in patients that have papillary kidney cancer. So papillary is the most common cancer of this non-clear cell cohort, right? So 25% is everything else. And in that everything else bucket, papillary kidney cancer is the most common. So we have known for a while now that these immune therapies that we use, they don't work all the time, but they do work consistently for a number of patients. But also some of these targeted therapies we have that were tested in previous papillary kidney cancer trials, they also seem to consistently work. Now, the question that we're addressing in this specific clinical trial is really about sequencing. Because in the clear cell space, for patients with metastatic clear cell kidney cancer, we've learned that doing combination strategies is far more effective than just doing one drug at a time in sequence. Now, one drug at a time is helpful, but doing a combination is even better in terms of efficacy, in terms of how well we can treat the patient's individual disease. But that's not always true. So oftentimes in oncology, we're always about bundling. We like bundles, right? We were there long before Walmart or whatever, right? So we've always been bundling. But bundles aren't always better. Sometimes they're just more toxic, and they're no better than just doing one drug at a time. Because remember, if you're sort of like bundling, and think of like a meter stick or a yardstick, like let's assume that that's the total length of time that two treatments are going to work for, right? If that's like a timeline, But so you could do both drugs for that entire length of time, or you could do one drug for half of it and the other drug for half of it. So if that timeline doesn't change, whether you do it sequentially or together, then doing it sequentially is better, because then the patient is only receiving toxicity from one drug at any given time, and they're not receiving toxicity for both drugs for the entire time. So sometimes what we find in oncology is the bundles are more effective, so they actually lengthen that yardstick or meter stick. But at other times, it only adds toxicity and no additional efficacy. So in clear cell kidney cancer, doing bundles or combinations definitely lengthens efficacy. But we don't know that yet for papillary kidney cancer. There's some data to suggest it does, and actually there's some data to suggest it doesn't. So what we're trying to do in this clinical trial is understand, is sequential therapy better or is combination therapy better? So on this clinical trial, patients get randomly assigned to starting off with one drug, and then, whenever that stops working for them, then we'll switch to another drug. Or from the very beginning, they get started with a combination. And in this trial, the combination is a targeted therapy drug, cabozantinib, and it's an immune therapy drug, atezolizumab. Now, the reason cabozantinib was picked is because in the trial that you participated in, the question was, which of the targeted therapy drugs is the most effective for papillary kidney cancer? And that was the drug that seemed to have the best efficacy. So that's why we picked that drug for this treatment. And then why the specific immune therapy drug? Well, because at the time we designed the trial, we had some good data that this was a safe partner to pick with cabozantinib. Since then, other studies have come out, and we've realized there's other partners that are also, safe to put together. But at the time we designed it, this was the best data we had on the combination. So, ultimately, the fundamental question we're trying to ask is about combinations versus sequential. So I'm fine with this combination or any, but this is the one that we went with.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that it's really interesting because I hear a lot of patients ask, oh, well, my doctor's putting me on a combination therapy, right? Or they'll say, oh, two different drugs. And as you know, I don't have that particular experience because I was just on cabozantinib monotherapy, right? I didn't take another drug with it. And I know sometimes side effects are something that patients are worried about, especially to your point, the toxicity of taking two drugs at the same time. But, something I hear from patients a lot is like, look, I'll do whatever works, right? Whatever works is what I'll do, even if it's more toxicity. And to be honest, I mean, if that would have been something that would have been presented to me as an option at the time, I'm sure I would have taken it because, I was willing to do whatever it took, even if it was like standing on my head for 2 hours a day or something, which is not medical advice.
Yeah, definitely not medical advice.
Yeah, definitely not medical advice.
That is actually a very interesting thing that you bring up, because at least from my experience, helping to guide a number of patients now along their sort of cancer experience, this sort of personal decision about how much am I willing to tolerate or how much risk am I willing to accept, those sort of related questions, it's definitely different for a specific patient at different points of where they're at. And the different issues they're having with other medical problems, or, if they've had a lot of problems from a previous therapy, they may be more or less willing to accept even more risk or more problems depending on their scenario. So it's a dynamic question that changes with each patient as we go along. So hopefully this clinical trial will help us find even better ways to treat patients, but also give us a lot more information that can help guide patients, with this particular disease, metastatic papillary kidney cancer, can help guide them on that personal decision of, which treatment is right for me based on that balance of toxicity and efficacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for me, it's just so humbling to see the evolution. I joined the I joined PatMet, which was SWOG S1500 initially, because as we talked about a little bit earlier, there weren't options at the time there were options, but there wasn't anything that was clear, as to what way to go. And so, Dr. Vogel's and I had come to that decision together that this was going to be probably my best shot on a clinical trial. And thankfully that gamble paid off, but I think about, just again, kind of talk about what we were talking about earlier, the evolution between the clinical trial that I was on, which was which drug might work. And now it's, well, which drug works better? Does it work better as a monotherapy or in a combination therapy? And it's really humbling to see. And I'm sure if I get some, some gratification, if you will, from seeing that, it has to be amazing to see, whenever you're working on a clinical trial, to kind of see that evolution and how it impacts patients, their longevity, their quality of life. I mean, it has to be really gratifying in a way to see that, I would imagine, as a physician.
Oh, it's really rewarding. I mean, when I just think about it, when PatMet was first around, and there was a couple of other clinical trials preceding it, really that's kind of what I consider, at least for some of these rare type cancers, like the first generation of the first step. It's like, well, we need to find some tools that work for patients. And right now we're in what I would consider like a second generation sort of space where we have some tools. Obviously, we're always looking for more, but we have some tools. So a lot of the questions that we're asking are really, how best can we use these tools? Sort of the upcoming or third generation studies that I think we really need to work towards are, how can we find new tools that are based on the molecular biology of these very specific diseases? Because right now the tools we have are sort of like general. They seem to apply across a broad range of cancers, but I think we're going to make a lot more headway once we get to that third generation of trials that are really based on the molecular biology of, renal medullary carcinoma or papillary kidney cancer or, XP translocation carcinomas or, whatever it is. So right now we're sort of in that middle phase where we have some tools and we're trying to optimize, how we can use them. But I look forward to, and I'm actively, along with a number of other people, really trying to create the framework so that we can get to that next sort of generation of trials.
Absolutely. And that, I think I completely agree with you. That's where I see the field moving. And it gives me, every time I come home from like a SWOG meeting, or I know ASCO's coming up soon, and hope to see you there. But, every time I come home for one of those meetings, I just come home with so much hope, that things are moving in the right direction. I do agree that I think we're going to get to the point where, things will be very precision based on your specific subtype, and maybe even drilling it down more than that. It's really exciting to see, because I think that we're going to make so many changes for people's lives, and that's really incredible to watch. So
yeah, when I first started as a faculty member, that was really the debate that was raging at the time, right? It was like, can we even do these types of trials? So it's really gratifying to see that we've answered that question, and it's a definitive yes. And so I don't hear at these scientific meetings anymore, should we even have these, rare cancer trials, or should we keep everything bucketed as non-clear cell cancer? Those were the types of debates we were having at these scientific meetings, a decade ago. And now that debate has been quieted, and we're not hearing it anymore. And now we're seeing all these, disease-specific trials. So we're getting poised to enter sort of that sort of next evolution of trials, which is going to be really exciting.
I completely agree. So if a papillary patient wants to join, your trial at PatMet 2, or just maybe if you can also speak a little bit about your experience as an oncologist, do you have patients that come to you, and say, hey, Dr. Maughan, I saw this online. What do you think about this trial? How does a patient go about finding out more information about this particular trial, or just, what's that relationship like whenever you have a patient that maybe wants to learn more about a clinical trial, but doesn't know how to go about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I mean, certainly I speak from a place of bias as someone that's very, embraced in this field of clinical research. When I have a patient that comes to me and they're like, hey, I looked at clinicaltrial.gov, and what do you think about this trial? It just gets me all excited inside. And I'm like, oh, yes, let's talk about it. This is amazing. The easiest way to start finding out about trials, admittedly, the website sometimes can be a little bit clunky, but the most comprehensive way of finding out about clinical trials is through clinicaltrials.gov. It's a website that the NIH, National Institutes of Health, maintains. So this is, all clinical trials, at least in the United States, have to be registered to this website. So it's a good place to find out about that. It takes a little bit of, practice and experience sort of navigating it and figuring out how to use it, but it's a very comprehensive way of searching. And for every specific clinical trial, it lists like inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, right? Who are those patients that are eligible for that trial? But importantly, it also gives you locations, where are the locations where this trial is open at. Because to participate, at least at this point in time, to participate in a clinical trial, you really need to be seen and treated at that participating site. So understanding the geography, if you will, of that trial can be very helpful. But it does give a lot of background information about what is it that we're trying to test or investigate in that specific trial. What's the treatment entities, usually they're drug, but sometimes they're device or surgery type trials, but it tells you what is that intervention that's being tested. And it doesn't necessarily give you all the information you need about like how many blood draws you're going to have, how frequently are the visits, but at least it gives you a starting place to understand that. All that additional information about logistics, some additional important information about safety risks, et cetera, that can be found in the patient consent form. But the first place to start, I think, is either going on a website like that or talking to patient organizations that have a very close pulse on what the research is like in those disease-focused areas. For instance, your organization here has a very good understanding about what does the research landscape look like for all these different forms of kidney cancer. So those would be the best first places to start, at least in my opinion, the best first places for a patient to start to look for clinical trial options. And then you find someone like me who's willing to talk to you about it.
I completely agree. I love that. And I think you're right. I think that something that I hear sometimes from patients is, well, I'm not able to go to like a Mayo Clinic or MD Anderson, one of those kind of those institutions that are known for doing clinical trials. I think MD Anderson's like #1 in the world. I think I read that somewhere, that for doing the most clinical trials, right? And so I always just share the experience, which isn't typical to your point, or you just look at the geography of where trials are open. But I did my participation in PatMet was through my local oncologist, right? And so that is something that even I still encourage patients to look at clinicaltrials.gov like you, because I think it's important to know that, you don't necessarily have to travel to go see Dr. Maughan at University of Utah to participate in this trial or other trials, right?
I'd be happy to,
Yes.
but you don't have to.
Yes, exactly. So I really appreciate that information. And yes, I know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to emphasize. Like PatMet 2 is open at 200 centers,
Right.
across the United States. We've got a few international sites that are opening. And when you participated in PatMet, what I call PatMet 1 now.
I did, yeah.
Similarly, it was open at hundreds of sites across the United States. So you don't have to go to a specific center. Occasionally there's like very small clinical trials that are only open at one site, but a lot of these studies are open at many sites nationally.
Thank you. Dr. Maughan, this has been a wonderful conversation. Are there any kind of parting thoughts or things that you want to make sure that our listeners are aware of, or you want to share about either clinical trials or your clinical experience? Anything you want to leave us with?
Sure. Yeah. Again, thanks for bringing me on, Laura. It's always just fantastic to visit with you. I do look forward to seeing you at ASCO. My daughter's graduating high school, so I'm only going to go there for a few days, but I'm sure we'll cross paths when we're there. I'm just always so excited and optimistic about what's coming and what the future is. I'm sort of motivated by the patients I see in clinic because I see that there's an immediate need today to make, all of your lives better. But I do remain, quite optimistic because I see a lot of great things in our future in terms of innovations of how we can either make these treatments more effective or more tolerable or safe. And I've personally seen that over my lifetime, just tremendous growth and improvement, and I see things only getting so much better.
I can't think of any better way to end today's podcast. Thank you. And congratulations to your daughter. I know it's a huge milestone, and to you as well. I know both my kids have finished high school now, so it's a big feather in your cap. And I hope that you enjoyed the celebration. A good reason to miss part of ASCO for sure. So, well, thank
Thanks
you so
again,
much.
Laura.
Of course, thank you so much. So Dr. Ben Maughan at the University of Utah, really appreciate his time. And again, thank you to all of you, to our faithful listeners, we appreciate the support. The Judy Nicholson Kidney Cancer Foundation does host this podcast on YouTube once a month, in addition to all the other amazing resources that we have on our website. And look forward to our next episode. Take care.